Thank you, Stephen. So our next segment here, we're going to have three shorter presentations, three 20-minute presentations. The first by Daniel Mellis, the second by Alastair Johnston, and the third by Amaranth Borsuk. And I'm going to introduce them now. We are going to hold our questions until the third presentation is over. And then we'll have Q&A and possibly some discussion among the presenters. And so first, I'd like to introduce Daniel Mellis, our first presenter. Daniel Mellis makes books and other text-based artworks on such topics as the poetry of philosophy, the phenomenology of space, the built environment, and the law. Experimental letterpress and offset printing underpins much of his work. His work has been shown internationally, including at the Gagosian Gallery in New York, and is in many collections worldwide. He received his MFA from Columbia College, Chicago, and has degrees in mathematics from the University of Chicago and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, after which he came to Columbia College and got an MFA in interdisciplinary book and paper. So I'm always amazed at that checkered academic career of yours, Daniel. Alastair Johnston is a Scottish transplant to California, where he has been party to the boom in book art since 1975, when he founded Poltroon Press with Francis Butler. He is a prolific writer on an eclectic range of topics, including the history of typography, African pop music, artist books, and independent literary presses. His most recent book is Dreaming on the Edge, Poets and Book Artists in California, published just this year by Oak Knoll Press. And Amaranth Borsuk is a poet, scholar, and book artist exploring materiality across media. Her most recent book is Pomegranate Eater, published this year. Her intermedia project, Abra, which is recently published in a trade edition by 1913 Press, was created with Kate Durbin and Ian Hatcher. It received an NEA-funded expanded artist book grant for the original publication of that, which is a limited edition handmade book, and with a corresponding free iPhone and iPad app that can be downloaded. She teaches in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences and the MFA in Creative Writing and Poetics at the University of Washington, Bothell. So our first presenter, Daniel Mellis.
So I'd like to thank the museum and can you hear me? The Logan family, Steve, my fellow presenters. And I'd like to say in my defense, I kind of dropped out of math graduate school, and it was just a consolation prize. But anyway, so today I'm going to talk about both Tango Scrovamy, so a key document in the history of Russian futurism, modernist typography, visual poetry, and artist books, and Tango with Cows, my visual translation of it. So Tango Scrovamy was by Vasily Kamensky, and it's one of the high points of the Russian futurists, who from 1912 into the early 20s made many books that were acutely aware of their own materiality and visuality, and were often deliberately crude in an attempt to be shocking and provoking. And Tango with Cows is my collaboration with the poet and translator Eugene Ostashevsky to bring Tango Scrovamy into the future and to translate it into English while preserving as much of its materiality and typography as possible. So the original Tango Scrovamy was printed in Moscow in 1914 on brightly colored pentagonal wallpaper. So here's a picture of the wallpaper. I think the previous presenter showing a spread, I realized that I neglected to show a spread, so I'm glad that was corrected ahead of time. So all of its poems are early examples of experimental typography and visual poetry, and are set in a riotous mix of typefaces. The book is particularly known for its 6 ferro-concrete poems, which entirely dispense with a linear order of text, and instead allow the reader to encounter the page spatially and associatively. So here, I'll page through some of the book, first in Russian, and then my working translation. Oh, it's kind of fun. So here's the poem. So this was about a telephone conversation. This is about his trip to Constantinople. The cabaret zone, or the cabaret scene. What we saw earlier, the Shukeen's Palace. And then the roller skating rink. Clear symbol of modernity. So in order to recreate the typography of the original as closely as possible, so the first step I thought was to organize every occurrence of every letter form in the book by style and by size. So here's all the sans serifs in the book. Here's a close-up of that. So that was kind of fun. So then I reversed the process and I annotated a facsimile with every, there's little codes for each of the letter forms that I've identified. And so, and this was really useful, but it also was kind of amazing because by doing so, I was able to reconstruct in my mind's eye the shop where it was printed. So I could say, oh, this printer, he had like this small platen press, he had 3 cabinets of type, and he mostly printed like little pieces of ephemera and advertising. So if the shop had somehow mysteriously survived behind a locked door or walled in, and it was suddenly open, I could go in and be like, oh yeah, I know it's here. So that was kind of cool. So the main sans, so it used a variety of faces. The main sans serif was Accidents Grotesque in 2 sizes, or 2 weights with a condensed sans that was not part of the same family. It also used the typeface called Latinisch in 4 styles. So it became Latinskaya when it was in Cyrillic, and then that became Literaturnaya, which became one of the dominant book faces of the Soviet Union. It also used a variety of display faces. Most were in 2 sizes. So there's a prize if you can tell me who was the type foundry that first made Skelet Italien. Yeah, don't everyone speak at once. Anyway, so they used 64 fonts in the book, and that was pretty much the entirety of what the shop had. So I've been able to actually find 4 other items printed by the Yakovlev, the printer. So the first one is Naked Among the Clad, which was sort of an earlier version of Tango. I'll go into it a little bit later. There's also 2 pieces of sheet music that I found, Amapa, the true Brazilian tango, and another piece of sheet music, In the Night, and a longer bibliography, work of bibliography. This is, several, like 100 pages or 200 pages. But they don't use any more type that's in Tango, except for a few Roman faces. So, I think what's most interesting is that the sheet music uses this Art Nouveau illustration, which is not used in Tango. And I think if they had used it, it would have been too close to the design of the luxurious publications the futurists were sort of rejecting. And the print shop must have been very contemporary. So all the typefaces were pretty recent, from the 1890s or early 1900s. And all but one were designed for the Roman alphabet. And many we would call now Art Nouveau. One was even named Secession, so the Viennese sort of Art Nouveau. And many of them were used frequently in newspaper and poster advertising. And I don't think this is a coincidence, because as I will get into later, the advertising was a clear visual source for the book's radically innovative typography. And because it used all the type from the shop, it's hard to make it's hard to draw conclusions from what type they did use. And so they might have chosen, so they only chose the printer. They didn't really choose the typefaces within the printer shop because they used everything. And it's hard to say why they chose the printer, because it could have been for reasons of price, willingness. If you went to this with a printer, they'd probably just say no. Like, I don't want to deal with that. It's like, no, just no. And also because the print shop was located right near the School of Art, where Bourliuk, the publisher, and he did some illustrations for it, was expelled, or went to before he was expelled. So it was like right down the street. So maybe, it's like, oh, great, we know that guy. So one question we might ask is, where did this come from? And the most obvious context and source is, of course, Russian futurism. So it's a mostly literary, but also visual movement, whose literary contributors included Klebennikov, Grushenik, David Bourliuk and his brothers, Vladimir Mayakovsky and Ilya Zanatovich. And the artists were also included Natalia Goncharova, Mikhail Lerinov, Kazimir Mrlevich, and Olga Rozanova. So they rejected their recent literary past and courted controversy. The manifesto, A Slap in the Face of Public Taste, said that Pushkin was as incomprehensible as hieroglyphics, and that he, as well as Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and the Russian symbolists, should be tossed overboard the steamboat of modernity. That's like the best, the dirigible of modernity. And this rejection carried through to the physical forms of their books. So in contrast to these more luxurious publications, so this is an opera program by Bilibin. So they published small and even crude pamphlets that were meant to be controversial in their unsophistication. So the first was this one, A Trap for Judges, which is also printed on wallpaper. They also did the Slap in the Face of Public Taste, so the cover is printed burlap. And they did many other ones with different kinds of technologies, including hand-drawn type of reproduction by lithography, this one, paper collage, hand coloring, rubber stamps, and the elusive hectograph process, which is some sort of gelatin-based office duplicating technology. So I often like to think of what they did is sort of somehow connected to modern day zines, which are also sort of deliberately like crude and use the everyday technology of the time. And the text of the book, it features poems on flying, telephones and movies, cabarets, modern art, roller skating. Where does this focus of modern technology come from? Because despite the name, the Russian futurists were also concerned with primitivism, neo-Slavicism, and linguistic experimentation. And Kamensky himself, before Tango Skrovimy, wrote an anti-urban novel, Zemlyanka, or Earth Hut, whose main character finds redemption and marriage in peasant life. So one source for this turn towards modernity is Kamensky's own detour into aviation. So during most of 1911 and 1912, he pursued a career as a pilot, but after a near-fatal crash in a swamp, he abandoned flying and rejoined the futurists in time for their famous tour of the provinces. Another is the strongly urbanist poetry of Mayakovsky, who was also on tour with Kamensky at the time. But another clear source for the transition in his work was, of course, Marinetti and Italian futurism. So Naked Among the Clad, Tango's direct predecessor, came out almost simultaneously with Marinetti's trip to Russia, with Tango Skrovimy following shortly thereafter. And so both books, I think, can be seen as a response to that visit. And so Marinetti, he extolled the beauty of modern technology and modern life, but he also called for a revolution in the printed word. His Parole in Libertà. For example, in the technical manifesto of futurist literature, he proposed that we have to destroy syntax, to scatter nouns at random, even as they come to mind. We have to get rid of adjectives so that the unadorned noun retains its essential color. And in his manifesto, Destruction of Syntax, Untrammeled Imagination, Words and Freedom, he says, my revolution is directed against the so-called typographic harmony of the page, which contradicts the ebb and flow, the leaps and bounds of style that surge over the page. We shall therefore use 3 or 4 different colors of ink on a single page, and do we think it necessary as many 20 different typographical characters. So it's not clear exactly the connections between Italians and the Russians would try to downplay any kind of connections, but they were definitely sort of in contact before Marinetti arrived in his favorite visit. So I think these manifesti probably influence Kamensky in his attempt to show up Marinetti when he appeared in Russia. So in a visual experiment closer to home, appears in the book Donkey's Tail and Target, that was published in the summer of 1913, and it includes some examples of rayist poetry by some otherwise unknown and perhaps non-existent poets. I can explain that later. And these modest experiments in sort of this visual poetry really anticipate Kamensky's use of the spatial page. But in addition to these artistic or literary sources for Tango Scrovamy, we might also look to advertising, which often anticipates and inspires the experimentation of the avant-garde. So Kamensky and the futurists are certainly interested in the visual appearance of the city as a poetic space. For example, in Mayakovsky's poem, To Signs, he exhorts the reader to read iron books, and Kamensky refers to electric billboards as hundreds of ferro-concrete poems in dresses from the fabric of X-rays, from the poem From Hieroglyphs to A. So the Constantinople poem that we saw earlier was also published independently as a broadside on yellow sateen, and the text states that it's for walls and fences. And in the roller rink poem, we see here there's this graphical representation of a cigarette ad. So here's the English. So the full text would read, for cigarettes only La Ferme. And for comparison, here's a contemporary La Ferme newspaper ad. So it's very much about advertising. And then contemporary outdoor advertising also bears a clear visual resemblance to the ferro-concrete poems. So we see here these permanent shop signs, which are dividing the street as a space, or these pre-revolutionary circus posters. I apologize for the poor, maybe a little hard to see. And these use also a lot of typefaces that were in Tango. It might be a little hard to see. And we might also look at printed advertisements. So these are advertisements from the magazine Cinefono, which is a movie magazine. And they have, coincidentally, this also has the word tango in it. The Amapa was also tango. Tango is like a really big thing. Like it's like, so it's, I think, just a coincidence. But, and I think these kinds of typographic designs owe a clear debt to artistic printing, which started in the US and Western Europe in the 1880s, and also featured this division of type into irregularly shaped compartments. So, these sort of are very similar formally, and same thing with these two. So I think we can maybe trace a lineage from artistic printing to Tango with Cows. And it's sort of ironic because artistic printing was a reaction by printers to the competition from lithography, which allowed so much more freedom in terms of the use of the page. And so Kamensky's poems would maybe have been easier to realize using lithography, and there's maybe a lot of reasons why he didn't, but he did do one later in 1917, this poem about the city of Tbilisi. And so, in my remaining time, I'd like to talk about my current work in creating Tango with Cows, the translation. So my collaborator, Eugene, did all of the linguistic translation. I don't know Russian. And I'm doing the visual and material design and production. So if you have any questions with the language, I might have to call him. He's standing by, yes. So one of the first things was to recreate the wallpaper as closely as possible. So this is a digital reconstruction of the complete wallpaper. That was also kind of fun to do. And then you can figure out, how much wallpaper did he need to use, because the wallpaper is 18 inches wide, and then you talk to the Russian wallpaper experts and find out, they needed maybe 78 rolls of wallpaper, and that, they only made 300 of these, so they were doing 500 to 1,000 copies of books, so I think maybe the difficulty in just dealing all this wallpaper was why they made so few of them. So I'm going to use the Getty's copy as we're going to have a facsimile as well as the visual translation. So this is one of the wallpaper, and this is the digital reconstruction. So that was also kind of fun to do. And here's like a really zoomed in version of so I kind of spent a long time just staring at like pixels, but it's fun. It's fun. And then here's like the printed version. So I printed it with 5-color silkscreen on custom-made Japanese paper, because that really recreates the visual and material qualities of the original. The way the ink sits on the surface is very close to sort of contemporary silkscreen printing. The really difficult part was printing it as badly as the original in the same way. It's easy to print something badly. It's hard to print something badly in the same way. So as you can see, there was like, the register was bad, the fit was bad, there's all this knockouts where the type didn't print, and the black was super watery. So I couldn't get the black to print as watery as I would have liked it, but you can only do so much. So the typography, I wanted to really recreate it as closely as possible, and not just use typefaces that were similar in sort of appearance, but really the exact analogs of what they use. So all of the typefaces, except for the large wood type, were based on Roman originals. So after I did my indexing, I found them in specimen books. I found digital versions, and then used type design programs to create, either modify existing ones so they would work better with letterpress, or modify them slightly so they're closer to the original, or completely redraw them. So here we see the Tango with cows letters, the scans from photocopies of specimen books, and my digital renderings. I think the process is actually pretty straightforward. It just took a while, and we're still not done. And then finally, maybe the most interesting thing is, well, also with the type, I also went through and found all the places where the type was damaged. So the printer wasn't using new type, they had been just using type, so some had dings and whatnot. So I then would damage the type digitally to match that. And then, it wasn't printed very well. There were a lot of problems. So when I print it, I'm going to use the same effects with the letterpress printing, where maybe there's a little less pressure, so the type is spottier. So it's like materially closer, so it doesn't look too perfect and digital. Because that's the problem when you use something on a computer. There's so much stuff that's done for you that it's really easy for it to look too good, and it really was kind of crappily printed. So it's like that's the challenge. So the translation too is also interesting. So Eugene would be like, well, how about this word? And I'd say, no, that has too many letters. And he'd say, how about this word? That's like too few letters. And so there's this sort of interplay between Eugene and I of trying to get everything to fit right. And if I had to add letters, would I had to sort of imagine myself in the shoes of the compositor of Kamensky to add the different the letters. But we mostly got pretty faithful, as you could see maybe from the images. So I think I'm about time to wrap up. Steve is going to tackle me. So if you have any questions, I could only go into so much. So please feel free. Yeah. After. Okay.
Steve asked me to explain what happened between Stern and Blake and the 20th century. So I thought that would be quite simple, except how am I going to do it in 20 minutes? Both Stern and Blake were painters. I don't know if you know that Lawrence Stern was an amateur painter. And the famous black page, which in all modern editions is just solid processed black, in the original has this wonderful wraith-like figure, which is a result of make-ready and the fact that the printer's tympan had been used over and over again, so there was the residue of old impressions on there that had caused the surface not to be quite so solid. So that's one of the many reasons that you should only read this book in the original if you can. Blake, you all know who William Blake is, a great mystic and artist, so I don't really need to say anything about him. But I do want to talk about why people are afraid of the 19th century. And it really surprises me, but I think graphic designers are just horrified by the excess, and typographers are also kind of revolted by all of the decoration and ornamentation that you see in 19th century typography. Personally, I like it. Even the really horrible stuff I find has its charms. But the 19th century was a period of great expansion in printing technology, because in the 18th century, you had education acts that led to literacy, and the increase in literacy led to a demand for daily papers, magazines, and lots more reading material than just the King James Bible. So in the 19th century, because of the increased demand for printing matter, you also had technological improvements in the iron printing press, and also most notably in the introduction of lithography. I wrote years ago a book called Alphabets to Order, and that was about the found poetry in type specimens. And printers buy their type from type founders who publish specimen books. And the specimen book is just a normal quarto or sometimes folio format book. And consequently, when you get to the large display types, which are 2, 3, 4 inches tall, there's not really room to put a lot of text on the page. So the printers tended to just use M's and N's, sort of meats and potatoes that didn't show any of the weirdnesses of the Q's and S's and Z's in their alphabet. But this does give you this strange sense of sort of concrete poetry at work in their specimen books. And if you're holding them upright, that Thorogood book, as you can see, it's a vertical format. So if you actually keep it upright, it changes your whole perception of the page, because you're no longer reading letters. You're completely mesmerized by the figure-ground relationship of the bold letter forms and the counters. And what you see are these sort of knives or little other interior counter shapes that then are foregrounded by this strange effect of looking at the text like this. And I think this is what inspired Raoul Hausmann in this poem from 1918, a poster poem where he's actually just set up some of these condensed Clarendon types, which look pretty much randomly but sideways. And to me, that looks like he was influenced by printer's type specimen. Of course, a lot of the Dadaists, in getting their work printed, would be leaning over the shoulders of the printers in order to get the kinds of visual effects that they wanted. A great example is a wonderful Caravana of Hugo Ball from 1917, a wonderful Dada poem, and I've juxtaposed it here with the Bauer Foundry type specimen from 2 years earlier to show the same kind of fragmentary appearance of the words, and also this mixture of types. To me, this poem suggests he's imagining what it's like to be in a caravan of camels riding across the Moroccan desert and hearing all of these strange voices saying, Joli fanto bambla, fale bambla. Rasigabnfa, habla harem, ejigo godamin. Higo blogo, rasagalaga, holaka hola, and lagobong, blagobong. So you go through the whole thing and you can imagine all of these strange voices, all with different kinds of colors, including the ooh, 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 down there, further down. So to me, it's just a type specimen brought to life by a visionary poet. Another visionary poet and contemporary of Ball and Hausmann, of course, is Kurt Schwitters. And this is photographs that his brother took of him reciting his famous Sonata. And I've juxtaposed it with a French pictorial magazine from 1891, L'Illustration, which does exactly the same thing. It was the first magazine in France to use photography on the cover. Before that, they used wood engraving. And when photography was introduced, they used to print the photographs. Instead of printing them on paper, they would print them on wood blocks, which were coated with photo emulsion, and then they would engrave the photographs. So there was this transitional period in the 1870s when they produced these magnificent wood engravings that looked like photorealist images. And on the left is a man saying, I love you, or je t'aime, I guess. L'Illustration was founded in 1843 and lasted right until the Second World War, so it had a run of 100 years. And every week they would include a rebus, and these are in French, of course, so I've had to find a couple that were understandable in English too, but the thing is the word and the picture are substituted. So the one on the left is temps vole, time steals, l'homme, time robs the man, and then temps vole, time flies, and then the I and the dice, l'idée, temps volant, temps vole l'idée. which, if you say it aloud, sounds like tant vaut l'homme, tant vaut l'idée, as is the man, so is the idea. And you had a week to figure it out, and then they would publish the answer the following week. And the one on the right is the character isn't in the spirit, it's in the heart. So that's a good one. The bottle of alcohol, they've labeled it alcohol. So that's the spirit, but the character is in the heart. So I was looking through my books and I found some interesting examples of what I consider as sort of early proto-surrealism. And this is a book, Illustrations of the Author of Waverley, from 1825. It wasn't immediately apparent that Walter Scott was the author of Waverley. He was a respectable law clerk in Edinburgh, and he certainly wouldn't be associated with something as degenerate as novels. I mean, that was the province of idle ladies, people like Maria Edgeworth, and so no self-respecting officer of the law would be caught publishing novels. But a lot of people knew who he was. So one of his friends wrote a lot of the keys to Scott's early novels that were based on real people and real places, who they were. And so I love this frontispiece that's sort of slightly revealing the author. And this is one that strikes me as really bizarre. It's the funeral of Nelson, the famous English admiral. And where's Nelson? Well, he's dead. So there's a picture of his coffin. It's not a picture of Nelson and his beautiful white locks and his eye patch and all the rest of it. And I looked at this. This is 1806. He died at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. And this reminded me of the famous Magritte redo of the Madame Recamier portrait of David, where he paints her. Well, she's been dead a long time, so he puts her in the coffin. But we all grow up with strong currents of surrealism through reading children's books. And this was true in the 19th century, too, especially when chromolithography was introduced and you began to see wonderful illustrated books like these. These two are from the San Francisco Public Library's children's book collection there. I love the fat French frogs feel fine and free fingering the fifes you see. The English have always disliked the French, so the French frogs. And there was a certain interactive element, too. Here's the Merry alphabet from McLaughlin Brothers, and you're supposed to look at the letter in the picture and figure out what it is. So E is engineer, F is, oh, for God's sake, I should never have bought racehorses. G is, gee, Hector, that corn looked so good, I just had to eat it. I is that engine giving us the finger? So the kid just develops their own story explanation of what these images represent. One of the other elements of children's books in the 19th century is the way the illustrations gradually started to incorporate initial letters until they became initial letters. And this is The Mother's Birthday by Mrs. Hughes, who also published a whole series of books called Aunt Mary's Library, where she abridged popular works. She even abridged Typee of Herman Melville for children, which strikes me as really bizarre since it's got cannibalism and all sorts of things going on in it. But here the initial letter W also represents part of the story. This is Gust, the children's nursemaid, and the two elder branches of that lady's family. So look at her, she's like old twigs. She's two of the branches of the tree, creating the middle of the W. And the greatest example of this combination of type into image, I think, is this edition of La Chaumière Indienne by Bernardin de Saint-Pierre from 1858, published in Paris. And you can see here the letters, initial letters, the Q for quaqueur, there's an L, another Q, another L, a C over there, cependant, that's a C. These are all wood engravings that were designed to fit right into the text to create this wonderful illustrations without being separate from the text, if you like. Here's an accidental artist book, which is a type specimen, and somebody has sliced bits of it out. Well, printers would do this. They would cut out bits of the type that they wanted to use. Either the customer would want, can I have a sample of that type? So they would razor out a bit of the type, or they would cut it out and send it to the foundry and say, oh, I want 25 pounds of your Pica Roman. In fact, Thomas McKellar as you can see on the right, wrote a poem, "Printers, spare that book. Cut not a single leaf. You know not half the pains we took, or you'd regard our grief." So that's an accidental artist book, I guess. Now, Walt Whitman was a famous American poet, but was also a typesetter and printer, and he had worked in print shops in New York, and he financed and published his own books, and people know his Leaves of Grass, which went through many editions, and every time he sold out, he would print a new edition, of course, rewriting it as he went. But this is one of his lesser-known books, and it's Two Rivulets, the author's edition, and he didn't have the money to publish two separate books. So he had this great idea. He would publish two books in one, two for the price of one. So it's a book of poetry and a book of prose. So the top half of the book is the poetry book, and the bottom half is the prose work, separated by the wavy line to give you the river theme there. And I thought, well, this is a brilliant idea, you know, two books in one, and then you can read one or read the other one. And I thought, well, wait a minute, there's a precedent for this, because a lot of early poems in the 19th century were annotated with elaborate footnotes that sometimes went on for pages and pages and pages and ran on, so they had to be divided from the text above by rule. And here's a great example, which is Scribblomania, which was written by W.H. Ireland, who's famously forged Shakespeare play, and then was found out and denied it till the end of his days. And this is a satire on contemporary poetry called Scribblomania, the Printer's Devil's, what's the word? Polychronicon by Answer Pendragon. That's a pun on Uther Pendragon, who was King Arthur's dad. And so it's an attack on all the contemporary poets, how bad they are, and then footnotes explaining what he means by those remarks. I love the wood engraving, too, of the goose saying, what's he saying? Cacoethe scribendi, the sickness of writing. Now we get to one of my favorite characters in the 19th century, and that's Andrew Tuer. There he is. And he had a press in London called the Leadenhall Press. His parents wanted him to be a clergyman, but he wasn't going to go for that. So he went to London and became a printer. And he published a lot of very peculiar books, books about books. He was friends with a lot of the Punch magazine artists like Phil May. There's Phil May's Gutter Snipes in the middle. He published books on forgotten children's books, luxurious bathing. The one down there on the left is the History of the Horn Book, where he created facsimiles of early 18th century horn books, which were pieces of horn and then later wood that were given to children with alphabets and numbers for them to learn. And he also invented a new kind of glue called stick-fast paste, which he made some money on. Tuer edited a magazine called The British Printer. Now, Daniel just mentioned the Printers International Specimen Exchange, and that arose from his magazine. Printers would send in examples of their work for critique, and they would say, well, we received a very interesting packet of ephemera from Mr. Haling in Cheltenham, and we want to say that it's really nice to see somebody doing this, that, and the other. And so then they had the idea, why don't we get all of the printers to send in 100 examples of a job, and we'll bind them and send them back. So this was the beginnings of the Printers International Specimen Exchange in 1880, and it ran for 16 years, and it gave birth to this movement called artistic printing, because the printers all saw what everybody else was doing in Germany and the United States, and they said, oh boy, look at that border. That's called chaos type. And it's a two-color random border made with some kind of acid resist to create a random pattern, and then you print it in two colors and you get this nice mottled marble effect. And they printed type on angles to try and compete with lithography, and a lot of wild new typefaces were introduced. So the Printers International Specimen Exchange was responsible for this breakthrough in graphic design in the 1880s, but Tuer, strangely enough, didn't really go for that. He went back the other way and really loved the sort of quaint chapbook style, the cuts of Joseph Crawhall, who was a very, very bad contemporary of Thomas Bewick in the 18th century. and produced a lot of books about the good old days with heaps of quaint cuts, and he liked the funky Caslon types too. Now, you're saying, why is he talking so much about this guy? Well, for a number of reasons. One of them is this book called Quads Within Quads, and this is in his Vellum series, books bound in vellum. And as editor of the British Printer, he had a lot of material to fill every issue. So he would put in little jokes about, the apprentice ate the glue or whatever. Some of them you can see down there. There's the new steam compositor on the title page. And you think, okay, this is fine, a collection of stupid jokes from his magazine. If you look at the front, it says, in unlocking the form, see that the quads do not drop out. Well, that's when you're on the stone in a print shop and you pick up the form, you don't want the spacing material to fall on the floor. Well, in this case, you get to the middle of the book and the second half of the book is hollowed out, and inside the cavity is a little tiny miniature version of the book you've just read. And that's the quad within. And you can see there's the title page with the same little steam compositor and so on. And one of the things that I really love in this book is the little neticons, or whatever they're called, emoticons made out of punctuation. You see the two monkey faces made out of ats and brackets and braces. The one on the left is the man who advertises in the journal, and on the one on the right is the man who thinks advertising is no good. He also published a couple of very interesting books by a friend of his, James Millington. A lot of these people, the Punch artists and some of the writers, the journalists of the time, were very, very creative and had great ideas. And James Millington wrote this book called Are We to Read Backwards? Or What is the Best Print for the Eyes? And this is because people, when railway trains had taken off and now people were going to W.H. Smith in the train station and buying a novel, a paperback, detective story or something, getting on the train, then of course the train took off and it's bouncing along and you're trying to read 100 miles an hour in a railway carriage or 60 miles an hour in a railway carriage. You're trying to read the text, and that's what it looks like. So Millington did a sort of semi-serious study of readings. The first thing he thought was, why don't we read like the Greeks, left to right, but when you get to the end of the line, drop down and then go right to left. There's boustrophaedon, as the ox plows, is what the Greeks called it. And he thought, that's great. Slight problem, if you made a mistake, you might have to reset the whole page, and you need two complete sets of type to do that. And then he tried, all right to left, or mirror writing. And then here I've got a quote from Legros and Grant's Typographical Printing Surfaces. It's interesting to note that patents for reverse type were taken out in Great Britain as early as 1864, nearly half a century before they were put to any real and practical use. And there you've got, for an example, they show you the opening of Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll, "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves," etc. So Millington he also wrote another wonderful book that I urge you to go look for. I didn't have time to put it in here, called English as She Is Spoke, which is a hysterical collection of how to speak English, but was written by a Portuguese who didn't speak English, but used a dictionary and a French phrase book. And so it's just insane. It really is nuts. Here's another plate from that Are We to Read Backwards on the right. And he designed a typeface without ascenders and descenders in order to save space. And you can see on the left, Kurt Schwitters did the same thing, as did Jan Tschichold and other members of the ring of advertising designers that Tschichold formed in the late 1920s. I'm going to end with a few pages from my latest book, Dreaming on the Edge, which is about book arts in California. And this is The Lark, which was published by Gillette Burgess in San Francisco in the 1890s. And this was the first magazine to be set ragged right. They did that because they thought it would be cheaper, but also it was the way typewriters operated. And so this is a little section called The Muse and the Machine, which is a dialogue between a linotype, Faber pencil, and a typewriter. And so each has their own voice. It's wonderful. The typewriter is very businesslike. The linotypes are just doggerel. And then the Faber pencil, of course, is the true poet. And then Sari Kamensky, book on wallpaper, printed in 1896 and cut in a trapezoid. So maybe a copy had made its way to Soviet Georgia, or pre-Soviet Georgia, for them to see. So this is Le Petit Journal des Refusés, which was Burgess's a one-shot magazine he did in 1896, and the idea was it was poems written by women that had been rejected by well-known magazines. And this is spread from that. T is for Thomas Bird Mosier of Maine, whose dinky toy prefaces give me a pain, and so on. One of his friends two of his friends were the Irwin brothers, Will Irwin and Wallace Irwin, and he and Will Irwin wrote a wonderful collaborative novel together called The Picaroons. And Wallace Irwin worked at the San Francisco Chronicle, our examiner, and wrote this book, Fairy Tales Up to Now, which was a collection of famous fairy tales, but done in journalism style, even using the type right out of the newspaper composing room, The Babes in the Wood, Kids Foil Kidnappers, By Dint of Heroic Coolness, Thwart Plans of Desperate Criminal Gangs. So written like a Hearst story. And the great thing about this book is the binding. It's bound in a flong, which is a paper mache mold, which was used to create lead plates to print the book and save the actual typographic material. And finally, What a Life. This is a book that appeared in London in 1901, and it was written by E.V. Lucas, another Punch magazine contributor. And he had the idea where if you took the Harrods catalog and just took all the images out of the Harrods catalog, what kind of novel could you make to string them all together? So here we have a sample on the left showing some furniture, and then on the right, Holbrook Teeter and Michael Myers, Fireside Book of Gurus, San Francisco, 1973, where they showed furniture shots from San Francisco newspapers that were supposedly invisible portraits of famous gurus who refused to let their image reach the negative. Finally, what is a book? What is an artist book? Anything with text, I imagine, so why not the Taj Mahal of Agra, which is a building made of white marble, and inlaid on the surface is the complete text of the Quran in black marble. So that's definitely a good example of an artist book, I would say.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amaranth Borsuk, and I'm here to talk a little bit about some ways in which artist books and digital books intersect with one another. I'm just going to set a timer for myself, and I'll try to keep a little bit under time so that we have time for some Q&A afterward. Before I start, I just want to thank, again, the Logan Foundation and all of the people present here today who made this possible, and that includes Ray and Andrea and Hannah, Daryl, and Danny, I think, who also had a role in making sure that we were all taken care of. So thank you, and of course, thanks to Steve for bringing us all together. Sorry to do this. Okay, so this talk is also available on slides.com, so if you want to follow along or check it out later, just go to slides.com and then /my name, Amaranth Borsuk. So I've been thinking a lot about the way we talk about the book as kind of a dead or dying technology, and that's been a theme that has permeated conversations I've been having, I would say, for the last 5 or 10 years. I'm guessing you frequently, like I do, encounter articles in the newspaper about the death of reading or the ways in which digital reading devices are preventing us from fully engaging with the book. So I've been thinking about the deep history of the book and the ways in which artist books often draw our attention to that, and that's been a theme across some of the presentations we've seen already. So for me, as a poet who works making artist books and who also thinks a lot about the history of books, Johanna Drucker's definition of the artist's book has been the one that I return to, that an artist's book by definition integrates the formal means of its realization and production with its thematic or aesthetic issues. It has to have some conviction, some soul, some reason to be and to be a book in order to succeed. And what I sort of want to stress in my talk is that there are a lot of continuities between digital books and the kind of interesting experiments happening right now in digitally mediated reading and what artist books have been doing since the early part of the 20th century, that artist books have been fundamentally engaged in thinking about the ways a book's material form and content can be put in dialogue, and I think that's exactly what some of the interesting work being done in digital reading is up to. As evidence of that, one of the preeminent thinkers about electronic literature is Kate Hales, and she stresses this notion that even when we're reading digital literature, we have to think of it as material in a way. So literature was never only words, never merely immaterial verbal constructions. Literary texts like us have bodies, an actuality necessitating that their materialities and meanings are deeply interwoven into each other. And what does she mean by that? I think she basically means something like what Craig Dworkin is saying here. This quote is from a book that Dworkin published a couple years ago with MIT Press, in which he analyzes a number of different works of art and literature that are entirely blank. And when you look at a blank artist's book or a blank book, you have to attend to all of those material qualities like the paper, like the binding, or if it's unbound, why is it unbound? What Dworkin wants to remind us is that a book is not just a physical artifact, it's an artifact that has to be accessed by a reader. And so we have to keep the reader in mind when we're thinking about how books function. This has already come up today, that artists who are making artist books are thinking about a highly engaged and active relationship with their reader. One of the people who I think sort of crystallized some of these ideas for me is Ulises Carrion, a Mexican book artist who actually originally published short fiction and was really highly acclaimed for it, and later in the 1970s turned to artist books and performance. And his definition of a book as a sequence of spaces perceived at a different moment, therefore a sequence of moments connects the book to cinema, and the notion that the page is already an animated space. If you think about turning the pages of your standard novel, and this was Carrion's complaint, they're all identical. They're blocks of text. You can't navigate your way through it by sight alone. That's why you need chapter titles and page numbers in order to orient yourself. But through these kind of visual approaches, like what we saw in Tango with cows, or many of those artist books we've already seen today, book artists have asked us to think about ways in which the page can be animated in a different way than a standard novel. Because I'm a poet, I'm always working with text. And when I am choosing to work in another medium, like an artist's book, or say a hybrid digital print project, I try to remind myself that text is fundamentally an act of weaving. It is an act of making, and yet in its very root, from that same root comes the word technology. So text and technology, though we may want to place them in sort of antithetical positions to one another, spring from that same space of making, craft, skill. Dick Higgins, one of the publishers who sort of was seminal in the Fluxus movement and the idea of artist books as a kind of democratically reproduced, easy, affordable way of disseminating artwork, gave us this idea of intermedia, that an artist book can be a form of intermedia. When you hear intermedia, the word media immediately springs to the forefront, right? That an artist book can be visual, sonic, tactile. We can have the smell experience of the metal-bound Marinetti book that we saw earlier. But essentially, the experience of reading it, viewing it, is what the artist stresses in making it. So when an artist makes an artist book, they are thinking about the moment of its reception, about that problem Steve alluded to, that this is a book that has to be activated to be experienced. And it's also, therefore, a book that is ephemeral. It exists as a physical artifact, but it doesn't truly come into being until the reader puts all the pieces together. So Dieter Roth actually made these ephemeral books, like the literature Wurst that we saw earlier. There's an image here as well. And famously, of a different artist book, he said, wait, later this will be nothing. He was very attuned to the fact that artist books are by their nature ephemeral. And I think this is exactly what people who work with digital media are aware of today, that any kind of digital book that we make, the technologies through which we access it are likely to disappear. 5 years, 10 years, archiving a digital artist book is just as complicated as trying to figure out how you keep this book from falling to pieces. So the first artist book that I wanted to share with you today is a book called Between Page and Screen. It's a collaboration with Brad Bouse, and it began as a limited edition artist book, letterpress printed and hand-bound, that I put together over the course of a couple of weeks at Otis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles. And the idea for Between Page and Screen was that as a poet who was interested in the history of books, but who was also doing a dissertation on writing technologies, I found myself really torn between digital and print reading devices, having to do a lot of research on my laptop computer, and then also going into the archives to look at physical books. So as a mode of sort of investigative practice, I thought, well, let's think about what is the relationship between the page and the screen, and what role does the reader have in interfacing between them. So that's where Between Page and Screen came from. Between Page and Screen is this book. It's a trade edition printed by Spring Gun Press. And the book doesn't have any text in it. Instead, it has these black and white geometric shapes and the instructions to find the words visit betweenpageandscreen.com. When the reader does that, this is what they encounter. So they're prompted, do you have a webcam? Do you have a copy of the book? When you do, click Start. And the reader's webcam appears. So hopefully what you can see up there is what I'm seeing on my screen, which is my webcam. All right, I'm going to try that again. So essentially, the first thing the reader sees is themselves. And you have to immediately grapple with that notion that the act of reading is one in which the reader is going to play a key role. And if I obey the instructions on this screen and I open up the book with its markers, that's when the poems should appear. Dear S, I fasten to become compact, but listen, that's only part your impact. I always wanted to fit a need. It's my character to impinge, a twinge of jealousy, that fang tattoo. Last night on the patio, poco a patois between us, unseemly and peasant. Pleasant. Let's spread out the pent-up moment, pentimento, memento, a pact, our stories spinto, no more Esperanto, P. So these poems in the book were written through a process of investigation of the Indo-European word roots for page and screen, which of course my initial presumption would be at odds with one another, that page and screen couldn't possibly have anything in common. Page comes from an Indo-European word root that means to join. So it gives us a lot of words about connection, pact and appease, peace, and screen comes from a root that means to shine, so it gives us militaristic terms like sword and shield. So immediately already one is the bellicose, one is the pacifist, and I expected that to play out, but in the process of writing the poems, exploring those etymologies and giving us a peek into their relationship, I found that there were more convergences between them. Dear P, I take your point. I didn't mean to cut, but it's my stripe, my type. I'd rather shear than share. I wear a scarf to hide my scars. My scabs have scabs. My heart's a shard. I am that Scaramouche. I like a joust. My tattoo says, keep out. I prefer Eris to arias, you've guessed, a bard of scabbards, a chorus of cuirass. Our nocturnal skirmish was a junto, just that, S. So the book is very much in the tradition of an epistolary romance, and when you are reading love letters between two people, the reader always has to remember these letters weren't meant for you, right? You're peeking in on someone else's correspondence, much in the same way that here I can see myself peeking in on this conversation. And in between their letters, you get these concrete poems that are animated that play with keywords from their letters. They're also very much in the tradition of the 1960s books produced by Something Else Press, like Emmett Williams' Sweethearts, where he does these permutations, poems in which you find words anagrammatically hidden in other words, as well as to the concrete poetry of the De Campos brothers. So over the course of the book, which I hope you'll check out on your own, the process for me as a writer was one in which I was investigating and sort of trying to think about, well, what is the relationship between these two things? And of course, it turns out that because page comes from a root that means to join, it also actually gives us some slightly more violent words like fang and impale, because in order to affix something, of course, you have to pin it in place. And screen, although it comes from this root that means to shine, it can also therefore be diaphanous and beckoning and draw us to it. So the poems sort of play out that dynamic in which page and screen come together. But for me, one of the greatest discoveries in the process of working on this book was the awareness that this is a book that is only activated by a reader. So, of course, poets know, right? Nobody reads poetry, so there are the 5 people in the world who want to buy my books that I can imagine are going to bring those poems to life. But doing this project with Brad really brought that home to me, that ultimately any book that we write, whether it's digital, whether it's an artist's book, whether it is a trade paperback novel that you buy in the airport, doesn't exist until it's put into the reader's hands. And that's sort of the space that Between Page and Screen is trying to explore. And these are a number of different readers, all friends and family, who sent us in photos of themselves with the book. And it's a book that changes each time it's read because it's different depending on what you're wearing or where you're sitting, whether you're lying in bed or whether you're at your desk, because the reader is part of the book. The idea of the artist's book as being multi-notational, this is Joan Lyon's notion that everything becomes sort of plastic and animated on the page, has become really interesting to me. The idea that the literature's content alters the concept of authorship and challenges the reader to a new discourse with the printed page. I mean, basically, this is the idea that the book belongs to the reader, and that's something I've been thinking a lot in working on artists' books that have this digital component. They fundamentally get activated by the hand of the reader. So, the next project that Brad and I had the chance to collaborate on was this project called Whispering Galleries. It was commissioned by Connecticut at Work, an organization that wanted to highlight the role of work in Connecticut. And specifically, we were asked to do a site-specific installation for the New Haven Free Public Library. And thinking about the library, my initial memory of going to the library as a child was thinking about it as a place where you could time travel, because it's a place where there were all these voices from history surrounding you. So Brad and I hit on the idea of a whispering gallery as a metaphor for the kind of space in which voices from the past come forward into the future. You're probably familiar with the whispering gallery. This diagram sort of shows how they work. It's a domed room where people standing at opposite ends can whisper but hear one another extremely clearly because of the way sound travels over that dome. Our desire was to create a whispering gallery that would allow readers to interact with this historic text. It's a diary from 1858 by an anonymous shopkeeper from the New Haven area. And we were drawn to it because it's a diary, and we're living in this moment in which the only diaries we really keep now are in our digital calendars or in our Facebook feeds or whatever sort of social media trails we're leaving behind us. Some of us, that's a blanket statement. I hope some people in this room really do journal or diary, but by and large, most of us don't encounter this kind of document of the totally banal everyday. That diary entry in the upper left corner begins in the shop, shaved handles and cut off heads. This is the document of someone's daily work. He would go into the shop every morning, shave down some tool handles. He might sweep out the shavings on the floor from the store. Later on in this diary, he leaves his parents' wood shop and goes to work in the local dry goods store. And the amazing thing about a dry goods store is that it's the place that everyone in town passes through. So in documenting his daily work, he was really documenting small town life in Connecticut in 1858. So how do you make a whispering gallery? The technology that we chose to use to give us access to these voices from the past is another kind of domed space. This is a leap motion controller, and what that little pack of gum size controller does is it projects an infrared dome above itself. And into this whispering gallery, when the reader places their hands, they can control what's happening on screen. So I'll show a little bit of documentation of the project just to give you a sense of it, but our idea was the reader coming upon the whispering gallery would see their image distorted in the mirror of the screen, and reaching out could brush the dust from this diary, sweeping away pixels, much as the person in this diary swept sawdust from the floor of the shop, and through that process reveal erasure poems hidden within his diary that told a different narrative. That narrative is the story of his life as a musician. The person who kept this diary also played the violin. So his hand was central not only to his labor, but to his art. And so our project tried to highlight that for the visitor.
In the shop, run handles on the machine, etc. In the evening, went to Martin Harrison to hear him play violin with a company of others. In the hand, to play a company of moonlight. In the morning, we start a lost journey. The hand came to ask for dust.
So in the process of interacting with this historic diary, the reader's hand becomes connected to this historic hand, and their gestures are activating the text. The text is there, it's latent within the diaries, and any number of texts could have been created from these diaries. So hopefully one of the things that the project does is that it shows readers an artist's book that gives them the potential to create books of their own, erasures from texts that they find in their own lives. The last project that I wanted to share briefly is a project called Abra. It's an expanded artist book, and it received a grant from the Center for Book and Paper Arts to do what they were calling expanded artist books, a book that envisions an artist book for the digital age. This is an animated GIF of the trade edition of the book. It's animated like a flip book, so the drawings on the facing pages reach across into the poems, which I wrote collaboratively with Kate Durbin, a poet from Los Angeles, sort of permeating one another and letting image and text interpenetrate. For our expanded artist book, we wanted to think about ways of animating the page and then ways of also referencing the deep history of the book, of ways in which the book is a technology that has fundamentally changed since its earliest form, whether we're talking about the cuneiform impression in clay or the scroll or papyrus scroll, or even parchment, or the codex book that is the book that we're so familiar with today. So the mandate that we were given was to think about, challenging traditional closure and envisioning an artist's book that is born digital. So the project that we conceived of, Abra, a living text, Steve has kindly brought his copy here today, so hopefully if you feel like it, you can check it out during the Q&A. It's an artist's book that uses a lot of different technologies within the physical artifact. Thermochromic ink that disappears when the heat of your hand runs over it, laser cut openings that allow you to see through one page into the page below. And last but not least, there's a recession carved into the back of the book in which you can place your iPad, on which the Abra app is animating, allowing multiple layers of touchscreen interface from the surface of the page to the surface of the tablet, in which you can then alter and change the text. So continuing this notion of a book that is only really completed by the reader, once you've finished working your way through the physical artifact, you end up in the digital realm, where you can customize the book and make it your own by adding language to it, by erasing words simply by touching them with your finger, and really customizing the book in the same way that we've always customized books by writing in the margins or dog-earing pages or writing our names on the front page. This just takes that into the digital realm. So this is just a very short video, surreal in nature, to demonstrate some of the features of the book. And the other figure in this video is Kate Durbin. So one of the great things about this project was that it allowed us to make a limited edition artist book that is a beautiful physical artifact that has gold foil stamping, that has heat-sensitive ink so that you can make the author's names disappear and just have you as the author on the front page. It uses foil stamping where that rainbow spurts across the bottom of the page. All of these devices that remind us of the very tactile and very interactive nature of the physical book. And this limited edition, there are only 10 copies physical artifact, then gets paired with a digital one that is free, that is widely available on iPhone and iPad, and that fundamentally wants to belong to the reader and become the reader's text. So I'm afraid I've run out of time, but if you're interested in seeing the iPad, I brought mine with me, and Steve has kindly brought his copy of the artist book so that you can check that out if anyone wants to during the break. Thank you very much.
Do you have any copyright issues with Tango accounts? Is that public domain?
Well, it's funny, I was just talking to Emily at lunch about this. So, Kamensky surprisingly died in the 1960s. So, for most of the rest of the world, it's I think under copyright until like 2030. The U.S., anything published before 1923 is in public domain. I won't go into the sort of interesting complications, whether it's considered, if something is published outside the U.S., whether it's considered published for the purposes of the Copyright Act. That's sort of a little too specific. But yeah, there's not, so I do want to do a trade version, so it has affected me because I haven't really approached, say, European publishers because they might not want to deal with potential copyright. Yeah, I think it's sort of, I mean, I did that analysis purely for making the visual translation. I don't think I would have done it if I was like interested in the book. Like, it's kind of too laborious to do almost. But it does, I think, give me this extra window into the production that really other people have written about Tango haven't really gotten into. The people say, oh, and there's like dozens of typefaces. There's unlimited variety. It's like, well, it's I think a really good reminder that like really kind of boring bibliographic approaches are useful for understanding the production. I don't know how much I learned from recreating the wallpaper though.
Must have been fun.
Yeah. If you like staring at a screen all day.
Not so much.
But you can listen to a book on tape.
Between page and screen, is there an analog copy of that book? Yes.
Yes.
How many are there?
This is an unlimited edition. It's published by Spring Gun Press, which is a press out of Denver, Colorado, and it's available online either from whatever online retailer you like to buy your books from, or directly from the publisher, Spring Gun Press. It was originally published by Siglio Press in Los Angeles, and this is its third printing, second edition. $20?
Is there a difference between the Siglio and
The only difference between the editions is in the acknowledgments in the back. We had a lot more people to thank the second time the book came out because of the great support that it has gotten.
Cliff.
Correct. No, Brad and I have basically large bills every month for the web hosting for all of our projects. That would be a really great idea, a kind of foundation to support that sort of thing long term. But I mean, that is very much related to the question of ephemerality, that if the server goes down, which it does periodically, the site is down and then the book is not accessible. The book is also written in Flash, using augmented reality Flash software that's in your browser. When we wrote it, it was built into everyone's browser at the time. That is sadly no longer the case, that it's fully supported. So eventually, in order for the book to continue to be legible and experienceable in this way, as opposed to just as like a book of ciphers that are more like a Dieter Roth, like grid shapes, we do have to then transform the technology behind it so that it continues to exist if we decide we don't want it to be nothing.
Or you could...
In continuing to make it accessible? Yeah, Brad and I are. I mean, he's someone who works on accessible websites and trying to make graphic design accessible to a wide audience. So in his heart, yeah, this is a project. It's meant to be fun and light, and as much as it has like an intellectual idea behind it, it's also just a digital pop-up book. So the longer we can make that accessible, the better.
Or you could sell like a version with a dedicated computer that runs the right browser that...
Yeah, that would be
Because like the Susan Sontag's computer is in an archive in California, and it has special software that every time you look at it, it resets the computer to the exact state it was at. So like the last opened metadata of the files gets reset too, because that's like important if you're like, so it can be something like.
That totally makes sense to me, and for someone whose work is going to be studied by scholars for years to come, like Susan Sontag, I think, go ahead and fetishize her computer, that's great. I don't know if we necessarily need our artifact to last that long.
Yeah, well, I think that's important, and exactly what Daniel was saying about if you actually look at the printing of Tango with Cows and count the typefaces, suddenly it's not this vast mystery. And yesterday I read an interesting article. It doesn't sound that interesting, but it was an article I'm a member of the Bibliographical Society of London, and I got their newsletter and diligently sat down to read it. And there's an article about the borrowing habits of English students at the Library of Göttingen in 1790. All right, you're all going, what? What's that about? Well, in 1790, the University of Göttingen had a library of 100,000 volumes. This is compared to 30,000 at the University of Cambridge and 5,000 at Harvard. And one of the 5 English students who went there in 1790 to study was a young man named Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And he wrote to one of his friends, and he said, "It's really important to have access to a great library. Learning is nothing, methinks, other than a sort of enforced idleness," meaning the luxury to sit around and read books, which is what he was doing at Göttingen. But from that comes reputation, and from reputation comes money. And that's where I thought, Sam, you're dreaming. So I think it's important just to look at lots of books. That's always been my approach, is to find books, to get lost in the stacks. If you find an interesting, nowadays it's great. You can just get online and get it at the Internet Archive or somewhere. And another article I read yesterday, not to belabor the point, was about Sir John Harrington, who's actually invented the flush toilet. This is before Thomas Crapper. And he wrote this very strange book that I got online, and I found the complete text and started reading it last night. So I was reading a book about this Elizabethan madman who invented flush toilets. And so that was, probably why I didn't get much sleep last night. It's strange.
Oh, one question.
Should we?
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting, the Russian posters found, the circus posters I found on eBay kind of randomly, and I'm really glad that I bought those two, and I'm really glad I did because, I've since looked at other books about Russian posters at the time, and they're all like the very fancy lithographic ones that people want to look at. And there's no, I don't know if there's any books that reproduce like these typographic ones, which are actually way more important for this story. And it's like, they're all, it must have been some Russian circus guy who had a bunch of them, and this bookseller would started going to Russia as soon as the wall fell and buying all their good stuff, and that was what he had left over, and so that's the story.
So, unless there's another question, I think that's what we have time for now.
Hand up back there.
Oh, where? Yes, yeah.
Yeah, they're talking about Alison Knowles. She did a few. The one that is my favorite is the one called Book of Bean. It's her second, it's like the reiteration of her first one, where you have like a ladder to climb into it. It's a series of frames that are all hinged in the center, and you can sort of move through these frames while hearing the sound of beans rattling in different containers, the names in the phone book of everyone whose last name was Bean, like beans from all different countries, or the word bean in like every language. She was obsessed with beans for a while. One of her first artist books was about beans. But yeah, she's one of, and the Kiefer that, you showed Kiefer, right? Or was that in the first? Yeah, so Kiefer was there too, yeah. Those large, like, two-person metal sheets. Others that you guys want to favorites?
Think of any? Taj Mahal.
I remember hearing someone talk about a Texas ranch house where the ranch hands had cut up 2 copies of a book and put it on an entire wall. So they had like a whole Shakespeare play on the wall, and they annotated it, so it was kind of this immersive environment.
Oh, of course. Well, now you say the words immersive environment, I'm thinking, well, of course, there are augmented reality books, right, or virtual reality books where you put on your Oculus headset and you're walking through text. And Caitlin Fisher is one of the people in Toronto who's really working a lot in that field. But it does seem to be one direction in which the kind of three-dimensional book space is taking shape right now in terms of experiments being done with technology in the book. And virtual reality just offers the possibility of contained movement within a space, and then a like multiply changeable space. So the book that you enter into can be different each day that you're in it. So that is one area in which that's definitely happening.
So, yes, and Alden, in answer to your question, yes. Our first exhibit at the San Francisco Center for the Book in 1996, right, Kathleen, was called Novel on the Wall. It was a visual novel on the wall. In our residency with Xerox PARC in 2000, we had a walk-in comic as part of that exhibit. And so people are thinking about this. I think our time is up, and we're going to take a 10 or 15-minute break. We'll be back here at about 3:30 with Clifton Metter and Emily McVeary. Said it's going to be a great conversation, so please come back. Thanks.